Ever get this feeling like history is stuck on repeat, especially when it comes to war? It's like
Yeah.
we've got smartphones and spaceships, but we're fighting for the same reasons people were back in, like, the Bronze Age.
Right.
So get ready to dive deep, because today we're tackling that very question: are we hardwired for war?
Okay.
Our guide to this ancient, well, surprisingly modern battleground is Dr. Elaine Carter.
Okay.
She's a historian who specializes in the really, really old stuff. Think ancient Mesopotamia, pyramids, the whole shebang.
Right,
She's
right.
got this book, The Origins of Conflict,
Yeah.
and it argues something pretty bold. The core reasons societies go to war, those root causes, they haven't actually changed that much over thousands of years.
Wow.
So whether you're brushing up for a history exam, prepping for a debate, or just find yourself glued to historical dramas, wondering, why do we keep doing this to ourselves?
Hmm.
This deep dive is for you.
What's fascinating about Dr. Carter's work is that she doesn't just lay out these historical conflicts, she connects them to our world in a way that makes you really stop and think.
It's like she's saying, that news headline you just read, yeah, there's a Babylonian version of that from 2000 BC.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so Dr. Carter breaks it down into 5 main categories. Think of them like the ancient roots of modern conflict. So hit us with it. What's the first root that, no matter how much time goes by, seems to keep leading us into conflict?
Well, it might seem obvious, but territorial disputes have always been a huge factor.
Yeah.
Dr. Carter argues that this goes back to our most basic human needs, a sense of safety, security, and control over the resources that keep us alive.
It's like I get territorial over someone taking the last slice of pizza. But imagine fighting for your life, for your family's survival. Those stakes are way higher.
Exactly, exactly. Dr. Carter uses a really vivid example, the Nile River. For the ancient Egyptians, it wasn't just a river, it was their lifeline, the source of their food, their water, their entire civilization. Control the Nile, you control everything.
That's intense. You can practically feel the tension building just thinking about it.
Right,
So it's not just about owning land, it's about what that land represents.
exactly. And that's something we still see today, even if the resources aren't always as obvious as a giant river.
Right.
Access to fertile land, to fresh water, to oil. These are all things that can drive conflict, even in the 21st century.
Okay, so territorial disputes, check. It's practically hardwired into us. What's the next big driver of conflict, according to Dr. Carter?
This one's closely related: resource scarcity.
Oh, man.
And when Dr. Carter talks about this, she's not just talking about modern day concerns, she's going way back.
Right.
She points out that even ancient societies weren't immune to things like droughts, floods, or other environmental pressures that could suddenly make resources incredibly scarce.
So it's that not enough to go around scenario. Like if my family was depending on that last slice of pizza, things might get ugly.
It's a bit more serious than pizza, but you've got the right idea. Imagine a civilization entirely dependent on the Euphrates River suddenly facing a devastating drought. Dr. Carter argues that many wars in the past weren't driven by greed, but by a genuine need for survival, even if it meant taking those resources from someone else.
That's a chilling thought, especially when you think about how climate change might be creating those same kinds of pressures today.
Exactly, exactly. We might not be fighting over fertile farmland as often, but we've still got resource conflicts. Water rights, access to oil, even things like rare earth minerals that are essential for all our fancy technology.
Okay, so we've got land, we've got resources, 2 things that even thousands of years ago were causing quite a stir.
Right.
What other ancient root of conflict did Dr. Carter uncover?
Well, let's be honest. Everyone understands the desire for a little prosperity, to be doing a bit better than the next person. That brings us to our next category, economic competition.
It's like that saying, money makes the world go round, even if it means going to war, apparently.
Sadly, yes. Dr. Carter uses the example of Athens and Sparta and that infamous Peloponnesian War.
Right.
Now, most people think of it as this big clash of titans, but she dives deeper.
Okay.
She argues that a huge part of it wasn't just about who had more money right then. It was about controlling trade routes, influencing other city-states, essentially, securing economic dominance for generations to come.
So it's about playing the long game,
Yes.
controlling those resources and trade routes so you come out on top, not just for a few years, but for decades, maybe even centuries.
Precisely, precisely. And you see this pattern echoing through history, from ancient empires battling for control of the Silk Road to modern superpowers vying for economic influence. The players change, the goods change, but the underlying motivation remains the same: economic power.
So economic competition, that's another timeless classic in the Why We Fight handbook.
Yeah.
It's kind of unsettling how some things never change.
And what's even more intriguing is how rarely these causes act alone.
Right.
Dr. Carter emphasizes that it's often a perfect storm of these different factors all swirling together that really leads to conflict.
So it's like a recipe for disaster. But instead of flour and sugar, you've got a dash of territorial ambition, a heaping cup of resource scarcity, and just a sprinkle of, I don't know, wounded national pride for good measure.
You're exactly right. Take that example we just discussed, the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah.
On the surface, it looks like a straightforward brawl for dominance, Athens versus Sparta, round one. But Dr. Carter pushes us to see the economic engine driving a lot of that conflict.
Okay, I'm game. Give me the economic breakdown. What was really going on behind the scenes?
Well, Athens was in a pretty powerful position.
Okay.
They were leading the Delian League, which was basically a maritime empire that controlled trade throughout the Aegean Sea.
Right.
Sparta, on the other hand, was more of a land-based power.
Okay.
And they were watching Athens rack up all this economic clout, starting to feel the squeeze.
Right.
And that bred resentment, which, as we know, is never good.
So it's that classic fear of someone else is getting ahead that can really poison the well, whether you're a city-state in ancient Greece or a modern nation trying to make your mark on the world stage.
Exactly, exactly. And then you factor in the cultural and ideological differences that already existed between the Athenians and the Spartans. There are different systems of government, there are different values, and you have a tinderbox ready to ignite.
And Ignite it did.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing how history is littered with these examples where one seemingly small event can spiral into a conflict that lasts for years, even decades.
Which is exactly why Dr. Carter's work is so important.
Right.
It's about recognizing these historical patterns, understanding the deep-seated causes of conflict,
Yeah.
so that maybe, just maybe, we can find more peaceful solutions.
That's the dream, right? But it's hard not to feel a little bit doomed when you look at the sheer volume of conflict throughout history.
Yeah.
It begs the question, is this just who we are? Are we hardwired for war no matter how much we evolve?
It's a question philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
Right.
And Dr. Carter doesn't claim to have all the answers, but she does point to one really important shift in how we think about war that gives me some hope.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
What's the glimmer of hope in all of this?
Well, for a long time, war was romanticized. Think about those epic poems like the Iliad.
Right.
It was all about glory and honor and proving your strength on the battlefield.
Right.
The human cost, the devastation that was often brushed aside.
It's like those war movies where they focus on the big battles, the camaraderie, but not so much on the trauma, the loss, the long-lasting consequences.
Exactly, exactly. But Dr. Carter argues that something has shifted in our collective consciousness.
Okay.
As we've learned more about the psychological, the social, the economic devastation of war, we've begun to see it less as a grand adventure and more as an absolute last resort.
It's like that saying, war is hell.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like we're finally starting to understand that on a deeper level.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And we see that reflected in the rise of organizations like the United Nations, for example.
Right.
It's an imperfect system, sure, but it represents this growing desire to prevent conflict through diplomacy, through cooperation, rather than just resorting to violence.
So it's like we're finally realizing we're all in this together.
Yeah.
War isn't a game with winners and losers. It's a collective tragedy that leaves everyone scarred.
And that's a really powerful realization because it means we're not just doomed to repeat those same mistakes over and over again. We have the capacity to learn from history and make different choices.
Okay, that does give me some hope, but let's be real. If these causes of war are so deeply ingrained in who we are, in how societies function, what can we actually do to stop them from bubbling to the surface?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a simple answer, but I do think it starts with understanding. With shining a light on these ingrained patterns, the more we understand about the complex web of factors that lead to conflict, the better equipped we'll be to unravel them.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly. And I don't just mean historical knowledge. We need to be able to apply that same critical thinking to the conflicts we're seeing unfold around the world today.
You're right. I mean, we can't just talk about ancient history here. We need to see how these same forces are at play right now in the 21st century.
Yeah.
So give me an example. How does this all play out in a modern conflict?
Let's take the conflict in Ukraine.
Okay.
Now, There are a lot of factors at play. It's incredibly complex, but you can see echoes of those same ancient roots we've been discussing if you know what to look for.
All right, so we're taking Dr. Carter's ancient roots of conflict
Right.
and applying them to a modern-day situation.
Yeah.
It's like we're historical detectives trying to crack the case of why are we still fighting? And we've got this live conflict in Ukraine as our case study.
Right.
Okay, so let's start with the most obvious one. Territorial disputes.
Okay.
That's definitely a factor in Ukraine. Yeah.
Absolutely. You can't ignore the fact that Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a blatant land grab, and the ongoing fighting in eastern Ukraine is partly about control over territory, especially regions with strong historical and cultural ties to Russia.
So it's that classic empire-building playbook we see throughout history. Secures strategic locations, expand your borders, all that.
Yes, but there's another layer here that goes beyond just drawing lines on a map.
Okay.
Dr. Carter talks about the emotional weight of land, how it gets tied up with identity and belonging.
Right.
And in Ukraine, those historical and cultural ties are deeply felt on both sides.
Yeah.
Which makes finding a resolution even more challenging.
It's like those family arguments over who gets the old photo album.
Right.
Except instead of faded photos, it's entire regions with centuries of history and heritage woven into the landscape.
Exactly.
And speaking of things that get passed down through generations, let's not forget about the economic factors at play in this conflict.
Right.
Because we're not talking about some ancient squabble over farmland here.
No.
Ukraine sits on some pretty significant resources, particularly when it comes to energy.
Exactly. Ukraine plays a vital role in transporting natural gas from Russia to Europe.
What?
Control over those pipelines equals major geopolitical leverage. So you have this economic tug-of-war happening alongside the military one.
Wow.
A struggle for control over resources that impacts the entire world.
It's like a modern-day version of those ancient trade wars. Only instead of spices or silk, we're talking about natural gas and oil.
Precisely. And then, of course, you have the ideological dimension of this conflict, which can be even more difficult to resolve than disputes over land or resources.
Right, because this isn't just a geopolitical chess match.
Right.
It's about those big ideas.
Yeah.
Democracy versus authoritarianism.
Yeah.
Self-determination versus spheres of influence.
Exactly. Ukraine's desire to align itself with the West, to join NATO and the European Union,
Yeah.
that was seen as a direct threat by Russia, which sees itself as this regional power with the right to dictate what its neighbors do.
So you have this clash of ideologies, this battle of ideas about how the world should be ordered, playing out on a global stage.
Yes, and often these ideological clashes tap into something much deeper. It's about identity, about values, about what people believe in and are willing to fight for.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is.
But I think the main takeaway here is that while the specifics of each conflict are unique,
Right.
you can often trace them back to these same underlying causes that Dr. Carter lays out.
Exactly. Whether we're talking about chariot races in ancient Rome or cyber warfare in the 21st century,
Right.
the fundamental drivers of conflict, the need for security, for resources, for a sense of identity and belonging, for power, those things remain remarkably consistent.
It's sobering for sure,
Yeah.
but is it empowering, Theo? If we can learn to recognize these patterns, these ancient echoes in our modern world,
Right.
can we use that knowledge to build a more peaceful future?
That's the hope, isn't it? That by understanding the deep-seated causes of conflict, we can start to address them in a more proactive and constructive way.
So what would that look like? What's the first step in breaking free from these ancient patterns of war and violence?
It starts with awareness.
Okay.
By recognizing these root causes of conflict, we can start to see them operating in our own lives, in our communities, and on the global stage.
So pay attention to those territorial disputes at the neighborhood potluck. Got it.
Right.
But seriously, how do we translate this awareness into action?
Education is key.
Okay.
The more we understand about history, about different cultures and perspectives,
Right.
the better equipped we'll be to navigate conflict constructively.
Yeah.
Instead of just reacting to the latest crisis, we can start to address the underlying issues that fuel these cycles of violence.
It's about building bridges.
Yes.
Instead of retreating behind walls of fear and mistrust.
Exactly. And it's about supporting diplomacy, dialogue, and peaceful resolution as the go-to solutions.
Right.
Not just last-ditch efforts, because as we've seen time and time again, war leaves nothing but destruction in its wake.
This has been a fascinating deep dive.
It has.
A bit terrifying at times, I'll
Yeah.
admit. But ultimately, I think it leaves us with a sense of hope, wouldn't you say?
I would agree because while Dr. Carter's work reminds us that human nature has a long and complicated history with conflict,
Yeah.
it also suggests that we're capable of evolving beyond our more destructive tendencies.
It's like that quote, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
But maybe, just maybe, by understanding the past, by confronting those ancient roots of conflict head on, we can create a future where war is no longer seen as inevitable, but as a tragic and avoidable choice.
Now that's a future worth striving for.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
For our listeners who want to dive even deeper into this topic, be sure to check out Dr. Carter's book, The Origins of Conflict. It's a real eye-opener.
Is.
Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and remember, knowledge is power. Let's use it wisely.